Hey, Ron, welcome to the show. As a way of getting started, give us a little background on yourself.
Hey, Brian, glad to be here. I've been in sales for a while. I live in the DC area. Came out of a computer science background, very nerdy, very techy. And then I decided I wanted to be on the revenue side of things, right, instead of the cost column. So that took me into sales. It seemed to be a natural transition. I've been in enterprise sales the whole time. I worked with companies that are, Series B all the way to the large billion-dollar plus software companies where I run like $100 million portfolios.
Cool. And what did you not like about technology, or was there something about revenue you liked?
I love technology. Don't get me wrong. I love technology. It just was kind of hard being on the cost column of things, and I wanted to be on the revenue column of things, right? So
Yeah.
it seemed to be a different lifestyle that my friends in sales needed.
You noticed that, huh?
I did. I did. Um,
And you sold some hard stuff. I'm familiar with Pega, and very familiar with Tibco. Um, I competed against Tibco early in my career.
did
So
you really? Who
yeah,
were you with?
I was with Sonic Software, which was part of Progress on the enterprise service bus area.
Yeah, yeah. Great founder, first of all. So that was the first thing I took away from both Tipco and Pega, right? Alan
Yeah.
was the founder at Pega, one of the sharpest people that I've ever met. He had this thing where every year during our sales kickoff, he'd play chess with like 8 people together and beat them all typically. So very cerebral. And then same thing with Tipco, tough product to sell, but it
Yeah.
was kind of a market leader, right? So
Yeah.
the hard part for both of those products was going out and making a little bit of an evangelization sale, right? So you're going in and talking about a product that wasn't quite defined at that point in time. Tipco's
Yeah.
ESP was. So by the time I went there, the ESP piece was pretty stable and was a well-recognized quadrant and everything else. But then there were a whole bunch of other things that were coming out, like Spotfire and the analytics piece that was still kind of net new.
And why leadership? What was the motive?
Yeah, so to me, the biggest thing is the ability to affect change.
Yeah.
So that was something that drew me to leadership for a while, right? So that's probably the first thing. But the other part that I realized once I got there was I really enjoy mentoring people. So when I look back at my career, and I don't want to make it sound like my career is done, right? So when I do a retrospective of my career,
Writing your memoir. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. But when I look back at the career that I've had to date, the things that I'm most excited about are the people that I brought into sales that weren't from a typically sales background. The background that we
Okay.
typically talk from a sales management perspective of the ideal candidate. These guys weren't those, but they were very sharp. They had the intellectual honesty. And today, some of them are very, very successful reps. Some of them are sales managers themselves and are kind of bequeathing that legacy downstream. So that's very gratifying, right? So, while it wasn't the reason I got to sales management, it certainly is one of the reasons that keeps me there.
And was there a particular profile? Was it like the pre-sales engineers that were financially motivated and challenged?
Yeah, Brian, it's a really good question. When I think about it, there wasn't a profile. It turned so yes, there have been a lot of SEs. That seems to be a natural progression. Sales engineers, sales consultants, whatever you call them. They already understand the product, so they already have the aptitude. So making that transition to sales, some of my most successful salespeople, sales reps have been from that background. But I brought in people from consulting, for
Yeah.
example, right, who have no backgrounds in software sales. They were selling services at an Accenture or a computer science corporation, and they came out and they're some of the smartest, sharpest salespeople that I know today, right? Also, the other thing that I think is really important is that whole BDR SDR channel, because to me, I look at those guys as the minor league to the majors, right? Because they're learning all the soft skills, they're learning the product set, the product market fit, all of that. So when they come in, they're ready to go, play professionally. They
Yeah.
don't have to be coached up quite as much. So
Cool. And you've had some pretty good taste and selection of companies to go to too.
yeah. So I mean, I've been fortunate in having had the good fortune to kind of be able to pick where I want to be. So I've tried to pick based on places where I can go and learn something new, right?
Yeah.
So if you look through my career trajectory, it was Pega to Tipco. Tipco was a much bigger span of control for what I was managing, right? And then I realized I really understood the public sector space, but I wanted to go understand commercial. So the next
Right.
couple of roles that I had was, All right, let's go figure that piece out. Then what's next? SaaS and high velocity. Let's go figure that piece out. Right. So that's kind of been what's been probably the one consistent thread through my journey is where can I go and learn something while adding value to the organization myself as well.
Yeah. And what motivated you? Was it the variety? Was it learning something new, or kind of catching the next wave?
Um, well, there's a question, there's a way to answer that question that's politically correct, and then there's a real answer, right? I think a bit of both, honestly. I think being in the next wave was important, right? So I have tried not to pick technologies that are laggards, right? So I don't want to go into something that, so somebody very early in my career told me the first most important thing for a salesperson, whether that's a sales engineer, sales AE, or a manager, or whatever, is confidence. And the confidence starts with your product.
Yeah.
So if you don't feel like you're taking value out to the field, you're always going to be the used car salesman, right? And you don't want to do that. So to me, and I've got to be careful because your podcast is watched by used car salesmen as well, right? So I want to be careful with what I say, but you get the meaning of that, right?
Sure.
So the whole thing is you want to be genuine and have a level of intellectual honesty when you're having a conversation with your prospects and customers. So to me, being on the cutting edge and the leading edge of technology, helps me get there.
Yeah. And what's the hard part of leadership today? Because it's really become complex.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think taking out, and I think it's been exacerbated by COVID, right? Taking out the human aspect, right? So, and this is, again, I worked in some great PE firms, firm held companies, but there is a tendency when you look at things from a micro level around economics, around unit economics, there's a tendency to take away the human aspect. I've been fortunate enough to be in companies where that hasn't happened, right? But I've heard horror stories from some other colleagues where everything's, the rule of 40, EBITDA and growth, and that's all they care about. As long as they can cut costs, they can get the EBITDA piece, they don't really care about growth. So again, that's the piece about picking the right technology, because then you're generally on the growth edge of things, right?
Yeah.
But the hardest thing for me is taking out the human element. For me, the way I work, I'm a people person. I'm kind of old school in that. And while I've retooled around, all the new tools and metrics that are available for SaaS sales, and I think they're super critical. I think the human aspect is very important, right? So when you ask me a profile, I don't want to say it's gut, but it's something that you kind of breed over a lot of different conversations and interviews and experiential situations, right? So when you meet somebody, you can see the fire and the passion, right? And you still want to double check that. So you generally want to have some more people talk to them, because salespeople are really good at projecting. They can be whoever you want them to be, right? And you don't want to hire, I don't want to hire 20 more Rons, right? I want to hire people who bring in diversity of opinion. So that human aspect going away, much harder with no travel right now. I think that's probably the hardest thing today.
And I got to imagine today you're managing managers. Is that true?
Yeah.
What was that transition like?
That's tricky. So I have individual contributors as well. And generally when you first go to that second level, the hard part is being a little bit more hands off, right? I'm used to rolling up my sleeves and being in the field, and that's what I do most of the time, right? But there are certain markets that, are dotted lines or solid lines into me that have more reporting organizations. And it's hard because, that transition first happened to me before the management piece happened to me when I went from being a technical consultant to being a salesperson, because I was the guy who was on the keyboard doing demos and figuring out a solution things. I had to back off and go like, although I understand the technology, that's not my role here. I'm going to back off and let somebody else do it, right? Same thing here when it comes to management and a second layer of management. The tendency tends to be, hey, I want to micromanage everything, but I know how this works. I know how it needs to be done. But the thing is, everyone's got their unique style, right? So you got to be able to pick the right people. So the good to great philosophy, you got to get the right people on the bus before you figure out where the bus is going. And if you have the right people and you learn to delegate a little bit, it can be very rewarding.
And what do you look for in leaders? Because it's very different than reps.
Yeah. So I think one of the things I look for is strength of personality, right? So strength of personality and character, right? People who So again, another interview technique is I try and see, have they sold something? And when I say something, it's a technology or even themselves multiple times across companies to the same person,
Yeah.
right? So are people actually trusting this individual? Same thing when you do reference checks. That's one of the main things you want to figure out is what's the what's going to be the end result of bringing this individual and inserting them into an organization culture that you already set. Is that going to change things for the better, right? Make up for the deficiency that I have, or is it going to be net negative, right? If it's net negative, that question, do you want the competent the competent mediocre guy, or do you want the rock star who is just hard to work with? I think there's a middle ground to that, right? So you want to
Yeah.
try and pick the people who have either, it'd be great to get the rock star who is also intellectually honest and great to work with. But I think the team part, the team play part of it, and the aspect of being able to drive people's attention and respect is more important when you're choosing leaders than the other parts.
And today, certainly as you go up in the org, the amount of administration, meeting attendance, kind of like the overhead of leadership versus the execution of leadership. How do you balance that? Have you found do you
Uh,
block off time or?
that's a great question. It's a tough one to balance, right?
Yeah,
So and this has become progressively worse again with the COVID thing, because what's
yeah,
wound up happening is people forget that you're normally spending 3 days on the road, because now you're sitting in front of a desk all the time, so you're always available. And when you're hyper available, people start, it's like Murphy's law. Like once you open a can of worms, you just need a bigger can to put those back in, right?
yeah.
Same thing. It feels like the demands on time are becoming expeditiously more, right? So I think discipline is probably the most important aspect of that. Is figuring out, look, whatever happens, I'm going to put, kind of like having a conversation with you. I turn my phone off. There's other things that are going on that are also important,
Yep.
but right now this has priority. I'm prioritizing this, so I turn my phone off. Make sure I'm not getting other messages and just focus on that, because you can't, multitasking to an extent is great, and all of us do it. But if you want to be super effective, and in the areas that you want and need to be super effective, you can't really multitask and do it to do it justice. At least I can't. There are probably Alan, who can play chess with people, can do it, but not me, right?
Well, that's it. And I think too many people go with the route of least resistance. They get an interruption and it's fun or it's distracting or, it fills up the time, but all of a sudden the day is gone.
Right, right. And
Yeah.
and then you're catching up, and it's like the Pink Floyd song. You're going round and round trying to catch up with the sun, but it's sinking. You can never get there, right? So
Well,
you want
that's
to
it,
stay.
because you can't talk to a client at 10 o'clock at night. It's like there's that window of real time, right?
Well,
That has,
so you normally can't talk to
can't,
them. I've done that as well, and that takes away time as well. Right?
yeah.
So, yes, no, but point well made.
Yeah. And how about as far as like the transition from personas? Because, you know, I got to believe Pega was very focused on line of business.
Mhm.
And then Tibco was more focused on IT.
Correct.
Yeah. And now you're almost on the sales operations side or
Yeah,
sales?
so sales, CFOs, but yeah, so it's the stuff that we've always been asking for. Is, hey, I want to get in front of business. I want to talk to more business owners, right? So that's what we're doing, and that's great. The challenge with that is IT is a well-oiled machine, right?
Yeah.
They know their sales cycle. They know when they need to sign something, right? And as a rule, most IT organizations are the ones that do most of the transactions in the company, right? So when you're managing a forecast or a pipeline, you have a lot of accuracy built into that, right? Because there's been eons of practice that these guys have on the procurement side. When you're working with business, business owners know they have a problem to solve, right? But now they have to outsource the acquisition to either the procurement team or IT, and whenever there's a handoff, you wind up having issues. There's always dysfunction around handoff and handout. So that's, I think, one of the challenges. The good news is, yes, I'm working with a lot with business. The bad news is I'm working a lot with business.
And you're doing big deals too, right?
Are doing big deals. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how do you teach that to, because it's hard to find reps that understand large complex sales?
Yeah, so that's the one place where I think I am a little myopic, right? Because
Yeah.
my belief, and it depends, right? So I do want to try and find individuals who are coming in at junior rep level and kind of learning and shadowing a senior rep and getting to know the motion well, right? But you need a couple of rock stars on the team. And my experience has been people who've done it once are more likely to be able to do it again, right? And I'll tell you the reason behind it, right? Um, in any world, you've got a quota, right? So you've got, let's say, a million. I'm just making numbers to make it easy for us to have a conversation. But let's say you have $1 million quota, and you walk into a customer and you believe you're bringing them really good value, right? And the customer says, you know what, I agree with you. This is going to absolutely revolutionize our business. I'll cut you a check for $600,000. Now, if you're a rep who's never had that big W-2, who's never closed that $3 million deal, you're going to say $600,000. I retire 60% of my quota. I'm going to take it, right? Now, if you're one of those rock stars, you're going to at least ask yourself the question, why six? Is there something else I can do to bring even more value to the customer that can grow that deal from six to 1.2 or 1.5? And if you haven't done that, and if you're not used to having that big W-2 or having lived through that cycle a couple of times, and by the way, making the hard ask and walking away sometimes, which takes a lot of guts, and it's sometimes the right thing to do for the customer and prospect as well. It's hard to do it the first time. It's
That is kind of the common theme I'm finding among reps because I do a lot of training. It's like once they get a certain level of win and success, the snowball starts to roll.
100%.
Until then, it's kind of like in that denial state or the scared state, or I don't know if this is going to work.
Well, it's a good enough state too, right? I mean, it's like, hey, let's take what I can get, right? This is
Right.
hard.
It's not. Yeah. What's the downside?
Right.
The downside's the upside, right? It's
Exactly. It's the opportunity cost.
yeah. But managing those rock stars,
Yeah.
they're, they're typically not the most uh, politically correct.
I've had some of those, yes. Uh,
Well, right, because they're emotionally attached to the deal,
yeah.
and the internals of the company aren't as attached to the deal.
Yeah. So that's where I started, right? Everything starts with the people aspect of it, right? And that's
Yeah.
so if you ask me what's my secret sauce, right? It's people. I love people in general. Like I'm a people person. I'm an extrovert. I like to spend time with people. So when I hire somebody, right, one of the first things I do, I'll take them and the significant other, take my wife, and go out and get dinner, right? I'll
Yeah.
fly out if I have to, but go out and build that relationship. Because you got to build credibility and trust with every individual, right? And if you have that credibility and trust, then you can have the hard conversations.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're right, and my job in those scenarios is being that 1,000-pound wrecking ball internally and making sure that they have a clear path, right? But some other times, they're not justified, right? They're coming at it from an angle that's super emotional, and it's not very data driven. So in those situations, you give them a soapbox, you give them their 15 minutes and let them talk through what their issues are. And then you have a data driven conversation with them that hopefully gets to a result instead of just being emotional and not going anywhere. But yeah, I mean, absolutely.
And you also are kind of unique in that you're not geographically in the same location as headquarters. Is that true?
I've actually almost never been at headquarters, right? So most of my
Oh,
companies that I've worked for have been California companies, except for Pega, which was a Boston-based company.
Boston
So
company. Yeah.
yes, yes. So that that makes COVID hard again, right? Because for me, again, talking about how I work personally, and everybody has their own style, and I tried to, early in my career, I tried to be some of my managers who I was super impressed by. I wanted to be like them when I grew up, but then I realized I have my own unique, authentic style, and I stick to that, right? So that's hard because it's not just sales. When you have a sales management or a sales leadership role, your sphere of influence and
Yeah.
what affects your outcomes is not just your sales reps or even your SEs. It's marketing, it's product, it's like all of these other functional areas in the company that are enormously important. And unless you can build, the connective tissue with them, you're not
Yeah.
going to be successful, right? So this situation makes it hard, but I normally spend a lot of time at HQ, right? I
Yeah.
try and spend a lot of time. And as somebody, I was talking to somebody recently, and they were asking me a question around, if I knew somebody in an organization that I worked at before. And I was like, yes, I have two levels of contacts at that organization. I have my LinkedIn friends, and I have LinkedIn connections, and I have my Facebook friends. And I aspire to have Facebook friends wherever I go at the end of the day, right? And maybe
Yeah.
Facebook is passe now and it's something else, but you get the gist, right? I mean, at some point you need to have a network effect within your organization, and selling inside is just as hard and just as important as selling externally.
Well, that's it, because that's very unique in that one of two things: either they didn't want you to relocate, or that you've been able to be successful being remote. Would-
Yeah. So it's not that they did not. So it depends on the company. It's not that they did not want me to relocate, but I am, I have a boss as well, and I have two bosses. I have a boss at work, but I also have a boss at home. And my wife is a phenomenal individual, very successful in her own ways. Actually, not in her own ways. She's way more successful than I am, really, and way smarter. So I kind of punched up there. But she works for a part of the government that she's very passionate about, around clean energy, and in the Department of Energy. So for me, DC needs to be my hub, right? So,
Yeah,
and the honest reality is, as long as I get to an airport, in this world, it doesn't matter anymore, because most of the time that I spend in front of customers or on calls with my individual contributors, it's on the road anyway, right? It's not at HQ. So,
it is. But I've also noticed through my career that geographic distance um, correlated highly with how close the company and your beliefs and your opinions got valued. You know, I'd say more for the Boston companies than the Silicon Valley
yeah,
companies.
I was going to say that. I felt that a lot more. I mean,
There
again,
you go.
a great company. I've got, yeah, had a great run there, right? So not dissing anything, but that's definitely much more of an East Coast thing
Yeah,
than a California company. Because even pretty much every company I've been in, even the CEO is not always from California. In
it's
fact,
true. Yeah,
both Tonga and the company I was at before this, the CEOs were, one of them was in Pennsylvania and the other one in Chicago. So it's, they work remotely very, very well because they're built around that. Versus the East Coast companies are built around the ethos of everybody goes and does something collectively. So
yeah, and the culture is very different. West Coast companies are more, granola and yoga stuff, and Boston's still very.
yeah, I got to be careful about what I say here.
I can say it from I'm from Boston, but
Yeah, I know. I know. Yes, and so is my wife, right? So again, I got to be very careful what I say about Boston.
yeah, and it's just
My best sales job, and I'm talking a little bit about my significant other here, but my best sales job, since you're from Boston, the best thing I've ever done in sales, the most impressive sales gig, not gig, but the most impressive sales job that I've done. Guess what that is?
getting married, probably.
No. Converting my wife from a
To
Bruins
move.
fan to a Capitals fan.
Oh boy.
This is where you get all your comments here.
Well, that is a miracle in and of itself.
Yeah, or I'd say a really good sales job, but I'll take a miracle.
Yeah. And like, what do you see as the next step in your career? Would you like to just continue building, or do you see CEO? Do you?
I don't want to be a CEO. I do want to be a CRO.
Yeah.
Again, ability to affect change. So the executive level is important. I don't want to be a CEO because there are other elements of the business that I don't think I'll bring as much value to, just based on who I am as an individual.
Yeah.
But what also gets me really excited is grooming people, right? So what I can see happening downstream is have some success in a couple of runs, and then go be an operating partner with a venture capital firm or something of that nature, right?
Yeah.
And depending on how many great exits I have, I mean, maybe I don't need a venture firm, and maybe I just do this, just to be, just do the right thing, because I think it's inherently required for people who've learned things to pass those lessons on, right? And I think you do a great job at that, right? But you're doing it at one level. Well, hey, if I've seen you, right, if I've seen you on a social media and I've learned something from it, you're doing a good job. That's the way I look at it, right? So there's definitely something to take away from that. So that's kind of what I feel like long term. I kind of owe it to give back in a way that's not single threaded, right? I still want to get something back from it as well, but I want to be able to contribute back to the people who are kind of coming up the ranks next.
And when you were learning as a rep about what sales leadership's all about, did you learn or what motivated you? Was it the things you saw done wrong or done right?
So what motivated me was definitely things I saw done right.
Yeah.
What was cautionary to me was the things that got done wrong, right?
Yeah.
Um, the human element, super important, right? Because you've got to be able to separate people from the business, right? And you have to make hard decisions sometimes as a leader that you don't like making. I mean, nobody likes to let somebody go when there's a riff or when you have to fire somebody.
Yeah.
And actually, an interesting anecdote there is, I try and make it as, I shouldn't say painless, but it's going to be a painful experience no matter what, right? And this is not necessarily an area that we want to talk a lot about on a podcast where it's being positive, but you've got to make hard decisions, and sometimes that requires you to sit somebody down and have a conversation that neither party really wants to have, right? And people tend to shy away from that. That's an important conversation because sometimes you're taking that person and helping them achieve the best that they can be for themselves, and
Right.
it's not with you. So the funny note that I had was I had someone who worked with me in out of Connecticut actually, and I had to let him go. We had a conversation. We had a very civil conversation. He obviously had an emotional outburst, and I get it. We went through that. We took some time. Let's sit for a while, and we continued the conversation. And it passed. Right? He left the organization. We went through the whole separation process. Then he sends me a text like maybe a week or 10 days ago saying, "Hey, Ron, not that I like being fired, but if I ever need to get fired again, I want you to come and do it." Right. So there's this human element that's so important that we're losing, right?
Well, that's it. Because if you're in the wrong role, that time is just wasted.
Yeah, forever. Right. And that's the good part of that particular story is that individual went somewhere else and was enormously successful, right? So kudos to him. We still stay in touch. Other things like pick up the phone and call somebody, right? I mean,
You can help them, right?
right. I mean, try and connect them to your network. It's fortunate to
Right.
spend time here. You know people who need people.
A
Like let's
better match.
roll.
Yeah.
So things like that are so important.
And what would you give credit to as far as, I mean, your ascension up the org chart's been pretty fast. Was it that you kind of found managers that were going in the same pattern? Did you build up your reputation in your network? Did you have social evidence of success within certain markets? Did you
Yeah.
network with great recruiters and VCs or
All of that is important, right? So I mean,
yeah,
for anybody building a career, you want to do all of that. You want to be talking to the Heidrick and Struggles and the Corn Ferries of the world and
yeah,
the other firms that are out there. Of course, that's important. But you have to build your track record, right? So, like right now, I wouldn't walk into $1 billion organization and say I can do that job, no matter which recruiter I know or which VC I know, right? Because I haven't done it. So empirically, I don't know if I'm the right fit, right? So the same way, I mean, that's one part. But the other thing is, I think I was very fortunate to have some leaders that I respected a lot, and I think I learned a lot from them.
yeah.
Tipco was one of those. In fact, the gentleman at Conga is amazing. When I was at Zephyr for a short while, the CEO there, showed me some really cool things I'd never done before. So, that's one of the things that I've been super fortunate in is working with leaders who can teach me something and value input back from me. So it always felt like the best leaders are the ones who are also willing to learn, right? So very
A-
lucky to have had that.
And you mentioned something important there because I think a lot of people ignore the recruiters.
Yeah,
Did you build relationships? You take their calls? Did you get to know them?
absolutely. So again, depends on what kind of recruiter. I'll be honest. Right? So I don't have a lot of time. So if it's somebody who's doing a contract search, probably not the right level for me, and probably don't know the right people to help them out. But if
Yeah.
it's a retained search firm, I always take those calls, even if I'm not looking, right? And even if I know it's not a right fit for me, I'll take those calls for the relationship, but also to go like, all right, again, people person, right? I'm in for long-term relationships. If you're looking for somebody today and I know the right fit for you, now I've got two pluses on my karmic chart, right? I've got the person I just got into that role,
Yep.
and I got the recruiter who I just helped find a great candidate. So, that's two places I can tap on later. So I think that's important.
It is. And how did you break out of that pigeonhole of public sector? Because sometimes people
Hard,
view it is
hard,
hard, isn't it?
hard. I actually got a conversation with the VC very recently who said, like, if you look at somebody like, and he was talking to me about something that was for grander scheme of things, but a comment that he made was, it's so easy to get pigeonholed there, right?
Yes.
And there's nothing wrong with it because people have
Right.
stellar careers purely on that. I have friends who are like crushing it every year, like, and have very good lifestyles doing that. But for me, given the path that I wanted to go, right? So if I want to wind up end stage being, an operating partner or an advisor on a board, I want to have a more rounded base of experiences. So it was very hard. So the first one was I had to make a very deliberate choice of saying, no, I'm not going to take that opportunity, even though it's very financially rewarding. I'm going to take something that might not be as financially justified as this one, but gets me out of that market. So that's the first time I had to do that. But once I got that going, then it becomes a bit of a, it becomes a chain reaction, right? So you do it once and you show you that you can do it. And people, and actually, I've also had the good fortune of being hired by people who I worked for before in
That's
another
key.
role, right? So,
Yeah.
so that becomes, you already proved that you can do one thing, right? And now you go like, hey, look, I've done another year or 2 years or 3 years or something else. Can I come in for a bigger role and do the same thing with you? And you get to move up the ladder and build that network effect that you're talking about.
That's it. Because I always told hiring managers, I go, look, if you can sell public sector,
Yeah,
commercial looks like a cakewalk.
yeah. So people who don't, so there's good and bad, right? So public sector is really hard to sell for emerging technology because like when we went to Pega was already on a quadrant, but you walked into government buildings and they
Yeah.
go, what's BPM, right?
Yeah.
So you have to go evangelize it first and then sell it. And now they're having amazing returns from what they put in,
Right.
right? So yes, for people who don't know about public sector and how hard it is to sell in there, they have this preformed opinion about it.
Right.
But
Yeah.
having said that, there is an element that's very different in government because the selling cycles are really long.
Really
So
long.
if you're in a SaaS model where it's all about land and expand, that doesn't lend itself very well. That's not to say that Salesforce has been abundantly successful in government and they've created their own models for it. So have other vendors, but inherently it's hard to do because that's
Yes.
not the typical buying pattern of the government.
Yeah, cool. Hey, Ron, I really appreciate your time today. Where can people go to connect and follow you?
Well, LinkedIn's a great place to go. I think that's a great place for me to network. And then hopefully, aspirationally, they make it from LinkedIn to being my Facebook buddies.
That's when you know you arrived.